Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in today's video I'm going to be showing you how I drew this dog using charcoal pencils. So if you guys that are new to my channel and like to see new drawing tutorials every single week as well as fun art videos, make sure you subscribe and tick that bell icon to get notified on my future videos. Also, if you guys over on Patreon, I've got the real-time version of this drawing over on there with voiceover so you can learn my techniques in real time. I'll leave a link in the description and a card up above if you want to check that out. So let's get on with the tutorial. I've left all of the materials that I'm using throughout this tutorial in the description below as well if you want to check them out and follow along with me. So the first thing that I'm doing is I'm working on the background, and when I'm applying the charcoal I'm actually using a paintbrush for this method. So the paintbrush I'm using is a sable filbert brush, but it doesn't really matter too much what brush you use. I found that even makeup brushes work really well, so really fluffy brushes tend to work well because you can get a really smooth, soft coverage of the charcoal powder onto the actual paper. So what I do to create this powder is I just use a really soft charcoal pencil and I rub it onto a scrap bit of paper like I'll show you now. And what this does is it releases lots of the powder which you can use on your brush to actually apply it straight to the paper. If you want to get a more strong dark coverage, then just use more of the powder, but if you want just a really light layer and you want it to be really light, then just get rid of most of the excess powder onto the scrap bit of paper so you just have a little bit left in the bristles to apply to the paper, and this will help you get those really light and mid-toned areas. So I'm just going in circular motions. I tend to do the darker areas first and then blend the remaining charcoal into the lighter areas surrounding it, so I don't have to keep picking up new charcoal for every area that I'm working on. So I just use quite a lot in the bristles, apply that to the dark area using circular motions, and then kind of go over it with the paintbrush into all of those lighter areas to softly transition into those more highlighted areas. So I also go over with a smaller fluffy brush just to soften everything out, and again just to smooth it out to give that blurry sort of effect. So what I'm going to do is pull up some highlights in a second using a bit of tissue, and I find that tissue is really good to not only blend out areas and soften areas out, but also just to lift some of the charcoal off the paper. So I wrap it around my finger and then just go in circular motions on the paper, and this just helps lift up some of the areas of charcoal and therefore lighten up the area. So now that I've done with that blurry background, I'm going in with a charcoal pencil, and I think I'm using the extra hard version, which is the 2H, and I first use that to define all of the main sort of shadows in the eye and get the structures down, and then I blend it out with a blending stump or a tortillon, and I just use that to soften all of the areas out, but I avoid kind of adding charcoal to the highlight area. I try to keep that as white as possible. And then I go over with a 4B charcoal pencil, which is slightly darker just to give more of a dramatic dark kind of shadow to the eye. And then I use a little eraser just to pull up the highlights. And that's all I really do. If I need to go over it again, I use the blending stump, or to soften the whole area as I just did, I used a little fluffy brush, and then I just used the eraser to pull up the highlights once more. So now I'm going on to the fur for the face, and what I like to do first is just add the base kind of contours and shadows using that paintbrush again. So I'm just getting down all of the contours, the shadows for the facial structure of the dog, and I'm just using some of that charcoal powder again to use this technique. You can also do this technique with graphite powder if you prefer using graphite pencils rather than charcoal, because I know that charcoal can get a bit messy and a lot of people don't like using it for that reason. So you can buy loose graphite powder and loose charcoal powder, and you could just use that instead of the charcoal powder if you wanted to. So again, I'm doing this the same as I did the background. I'm just using more charcoal powder for the darker areas, and then just using a bit of remaining charcoal on the brush to do the lighter areas. And I'm just really following the reference photo. I did use a reference photo for this, just so you want to use a reference photo if you're trying to draw realistically, so that you can really see all of the details and where all of the shadows are meant to be. I'm also filling in the darkest areas on the nose and the mouth. The nose and the mouth were really dark, so there's a lot of really dark areas that I needed to fill in around this area, especially with the gums and the inside of the mouth. It's just very dark. So I used a 4B charcoal pencil for that, just so that it's really dark, and it also means that there's a lot of powder so that we can blend it all out like I'm doing now. I'm using that brush to soften up the area, blend some of the charcoal powder into nearby areas so that it kind of smooths everything out and so we have no white areas left. I also added a bit of the charcoal powder to the tongue as well. So now I'm just using a fluffy brush to add a bit more tone to the rest of the face. I didn't want any areas to be left white because we're going to be pulling up highlights later on and creating the fur texture with an eraser. So I really wanted the eraser marks to show up, so I didn't want any white areas. So now I'm going in with an eraser, and what I did was I cut the edge off of the eraser to create more of a defined edge so that I can get really precise fur strokes. And what I'm doing is I'm just looking at the reference photo and I'm just kind of sweeping that eraser over the ear, so where it's meeting the background, to create more of a natural fur texture to the ear and the rest of the face. If you want to get more defined bright highlights, then just press a bit harder with the eraser, but if you just want to slightly lighten the area and get that sort of fur texture, then just really lightly use that eraser on that area. I'm also applying the highlights for the tongue and the mouth, and especially the shine in the gum area. So I'm just using the eraser for that as well, and I'll use it on the nose as well to pull up the highlights. If you're trying to draw something realistically, then it's all about contrast. It's all about getting the shadows as dark as they need to be and then having the highlights as bright as they need to be to create that contrast and give that three-dimensional look. So when I add the highlights, it will really just make everything pop and really stand out. So now I'm just going throughout the whole of the dog's face and just creating the same fur strokes to create the fur texture for the whole of the fur. It's a really simple technique. It's just something that you do throughout the whole of the fur, and these will look a bit too defined at the moment, and then we can soften them out later on so it's not so defined and so harsh. But for now I'm just getting in all of those really bright white kind of highlights. It doesn't matter if you go too bright because we can tone it down. That's why we went a bit darker at the start, just so these firm strokes would show up. And it doesn't matter if you go too bright, so we can add more charcoal powder or we can just kind of use the tissue to blend it out. So I'm just finishing up adding all of the little fur strokes. It does take a while, so just be patient with it. With realism, you don't want to rush. And now what I'm doing is I'm using a clean tissue. It's really important that you use a clean tissue for this part. And I'm just softening out the areas so that we still have some of that fur texture showing through, but it's more subtle, it's not so harsh, and it's kind of darkening up the highlighted fur strokes that we did, but also lightening up the kind of dark shadows in between them. So it just kind of balances it all out and gives us more of a natural fur texture. So once I did that, I'm going back in with the eraser and just pulling up the brightest highlights and the brightest kind of contoured areas. So just to create more of that 3D structure for the face and to make it pop a bit more. Because when we used the tissue, it did dull down some of the highlights. So we want to pull up the brightest ones again. So now what I'm doing is, again, I want to add more contrast. So I'm using the charcoal pencil on the background just to create more of a contrast between the dark shadows of the background and the really highlighted fur. So I'm just doing that, and I'm also adding some shadows to the eyes and also just adding some darker fur strokes. I'm just working on the shadows to create that contrast and deepen up the shadows. Because we used a lot of the eraser, we created a lot of highlights, so we may have lightened up some of the shadowed areas too much. So as you can see, this stage is really making it pop even more, just adding those shadows again and really darkening up those areas. You can see that we've got such a good contrast between the dark shadows and the highlights in the fur that it's really starting to pop and look really good now. You can also use your blending stick to blend out areas if you want, so it doesn't look grainy. You don't really want any areas to look too grainy, so it's always good to blend with the blending stump. So like with the background, I'm applying the charcoal and then I'm blending it out with the blending stump. So now I'm moving on to the body and I'm doing the exact same technique as I did with the face. So the first thing that I'm doing is I'm using that paintbrush again with the charcoal powder, and I'm just creating those general structures and shadows, and I'm leaving the highlights white just so that I know where all of the shadows are and where all of the highlights are. So I'm also creating that collar using the extra hard charcoal pencil so I get a really crisp defined edge, and I'm using that charcoal powder from that collar to smudge into the rest of the areas to create more shadows and more contrast. I'm also using a blending stump to spread some of that charcoal powder over to the darker areas. And then once I've done that, I'm going to go back in with the eraser to create the fur texture. So again, you can see that I'm using the exact same method. I'm just using the eraser, but this time the fur is mostly a lot longer than with the face. The face had quite short fur, whereas the fur under kind of his neck is a lot longer. So I'm using longer strokes with the eraser just to create that longer illusion of fur. There are some areas where it's still quite short, so I'm making sure that I'm looking at my reference photo in the specific areas to see whether I need to do short or long fur. And it's also really, really important when you're doing fur to look at the direction that the fur is going in. If you want to make something look realistic, then you need to be looking at the direction that each patch of fur is going in, because not the whole of the face is not going in the same direction. The fur is going in different directions as it kind of goes around the structures of the face. I went over it with the tissue again to soften everything out to make it look not so harsh, and then once again I'm going in with the charcoal pencils to add the shadows and increase the contrast. You need to make sure also that you start with a really accurate sketch. So always take quite a lot of time just to get the sketch as accurate as possible. You can use lots of different methods. You can either transfer the image directly, or you can freehand it just by using your eyes to kind of eyeball it. Or you can use a drawing grid and use your ruler to measure out certain key points and anything like that. So just make sure that you start with a really accurate sketch before you go in and do all of the shading, because you don't want to realise halfway through that you've made a mistake and therefore it'd be too kind of far into the drawing to adjust it. So now I'm just tweaking things. I'm darkening up certain areas with the charcoal pencil and I'm lifting up certain areas with the eraser. Now I'm going in with the eraser again, and I kind of cut off the edge again to make it a really defined point so that I could create these whiskers. I'm also adding the paws around where the whiskers are coming from. And now what I want to do now is just look at the whole piece as a whole and look at the contrast, see where I need to darken up certain areas and lift certain areas just to get the best possible look for this drawing. You really want to make it pop as much as possible, so you can either take a photo of your drawing and compare it to the original to see what areas you need to tweak, or just use your observation to think about what would need darkening and what needs to be a bit lighter. Anyway guys, that's it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you've learned any new techniques, and please comment below any of your methods for drawing fur. If you've got any other kind of techniques that you want to share with us, make sure you do that in the comment section below. Also, if you do want to see a real-time version of this with slower commentary and follow along with me, then make sure that you check out my Patreon. I have left a link in the description so you can check that out. Thank you guys so much for watching. Also, all of the materials are in the description below as well as all of my social media links if you want to follow me on there as well. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in my next tutorial. Bye!